Hello and welcome to the EconBuff podcast. I'm your host, Lee Stitzel. With me today is Dr. Tyler Ransom. Dr. Ransom is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Oklahoma. He's a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor and a fellow at the Global Labor Organization. His research has had a significant policy impact and has been featured in major outlets such as the New York Times, The Economist, The Atlantic, and The Guardian. Tyler, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Lee. It's a pleasure to be here.
So our topic today is a working paper that you've got out that's about seed oil. I don't have the title in front of me, embarrassing for me, but it's basically about the idea of seed oils and their link to obesity. And so I just want to start with a simple question for those that might not know, what even are seed oils?
Great question. It depends on who you ask, but most people agree on the following eight seed oils: corn, canola, cottonseed, soybean, sunflower, safflower, and grapeseed and rice bran oils. And then some people think that peanut oil might also be bad.
So those are seed oil is a byproduct of those things, or how does that work?
Basically, the factory gets, say, some soybeans in, and they press them down really hard. Some oil comes out, and they use other processes to extract the oil. And then it gets further processed, and then it gets bottled and shows up in the supermarket as soybean oil or whatever the raw product is.
So you have these raw products and then they're going into the food supply. Can you talk a little bit about how that works?
Sure. So, you know, these products didn't exist 150, 200 years ago. The only seed oils that were available were ones that were readily derived from, so basically just sesame seed, um, and maybe another one that I'm forgetting. So some of these oils, or if you had like walnuts or almonds, like you can press those down at your house and some oil will come out and you could use that for cooking or whatever. Um, where the innovation kind of came in was that these things could be chemically extracted and deodorized in a way that made them more palatable to humans. And then they could be used to substitute for animal-based fats or other saturated fats. And
Uh,
then nowadays they're used a lot in basically any kind of processed food, any kind of frying oil, these types of uses.
uh, so I know you're an economist, so I may be venturing too far afield, so I apologize in advance. Is this discovery like an intentional thing, or was it like an accident byproduct kind of?
I mean, I haven't read all the history books on this, but my understanding roughly is that people noticed that cotton seeds in the mid 19th century were just kind of being thrown out, and they're like, well, we can get something out of this, and so they tried to use it for like a substitute for fuel that's used to heat houses or provide light. They used it to like treat leather, so a lot of like non-food uses. But then they also started to become used to sort of be hidden in olive oil to kind of dilute the product, but still sell it at the top price. So anyone who's familiar with economics of information or product labeling, that you can see where those forces would collide. And then the big kind of kicker was um, a guy named Wesson, which is what the oil company's named after. He discovered how to deodorize it so that it wasn't as obvious of a taste. And then in early 1900s, they figured out how to solidify these things. So it's called hydrogenation, which is where you turn a liquid oil into a solid fat. And kind of those two things paved the way for more broad-based use in the food supply. And so in 1911, Crisco was launched, which is an American. Was meant to be a large substitute, and it literally comes from the words crystallized cottonseed oil. And so that's kind of once there was a solid version, then it could be used for a lot broader food usage, and then things kind of took off from there.
Is cottonseed oil used in food products?
It still is today, yeah. I mean, I don't think it's the most popular one, but it was the backbone of Crisco back in the original, 100 plus years ago.
But I don't want to lose track of the information element that you were talking about. That's actually a big part of what you're doing in the paper, and I think actually something the audience would be really interested in. But cottonseed oil doesn't sound that appetizing as a food product. I guess like I'm not immediately like opposed to peanut oil or whatever you said. So how is it that cottonseed oil can be in a food product after doing, what'd you say, leather tanning and heating houses?
Yeah, I mean, you can use any sort of oil or fat for a lot of different uses. Um, these things can be used for lotions and lip balm and stuff, and you could use like a solid fat, like a beef tallow or a pork lard for that. You could also use one of these hydrogenated oils that sort of has the same consistency. So I'm not an expert on food chemistry, but there's a lot of ways you can use these products in foods that would improve their texture or their flavor or the mouthfeel, whatever the attribute is that you're trying to refine.
So can you lay out your basic, I hesitate to call it an argument, but can you kind of lay out your basic idea here? Because now we can sort of see there's these seed oils being used in food preparation, and then you're gonna argue that that's related to obesity. Can you kind of lay out the general broad strokes of the argument for us?
Yeah. So there's plenty of scientific evidence showing that um, the seed oils are bad for your health. Um, there's also plenty of scientific evidence showing that they're not bad for your health, which is a point of confusion and ambiguity to the typical person. But to kind of get back to your original question, where seed oils come into play is they've just been increasingly used in all the processed foods in our food supply. And so, as the level of seed oil consumption has gone up, so has obesity rate pretty much in tandem. And there's other books out there that have been written that show that the omega balance of the diet is a really important determinant of health. So the deal with seed oils is they're high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fats, whereas something like a fish oil or some other plant-based product would have a higher ratio of omega-3 polyunsaturated fats. And what sort of started the seed oils becoming more common was something called the diet heart hypothesis, which was proposed in 1950-ish, 1952 by Ansel Keys. And I think it was centered a lot around uh, President Eisenhower at the time had suffered a heart attack. And so the salience of this heart disease topic became really concentrated. And so people wanted to know, well, how do I avoid having a heart attack? And so then Ansel Keys came up with this idea that, or this hypothesis that saturated fat accumulates in your arteries and causes blockages. And then that's why people have heart attacks.
And that's still like the main working theory of that today. Is
Yeah, I
that
would
right?
say that that viewpoint continues to persist to this day.
Yeah. So
Um,
persist or would it dominate, would you say?
yeah, I mean, I think it would dominate. So if you look at the New York Times from, we're taping this on November 12th, and 3 days earlier, there was a New York Times piece talking about how seed oils are not bad for you. Um, and so, this stuff is still happening today because there are powerful forces that have vested interest in making sure that the status quo is maintained, which that kind of gets into the conceptual theory in my paper about the political economy surrounding this,
Right.
where, there's information asymmetries and people have vested interests in certain outcomes. And so then the information that eventually makes its way to the consumer in the form of dietary advice or recommendations gets shaded by the interaction of all the other incentives in the system.
So is it kind of a mixed evidence about the potential health impacts, whether good or bad, about seed oils, and that's what you're sort of exploring here? And
I would
then we're talking
say
about the economics of that, or I'm trying to kind of establish how the audience ought to think about the health fundamentals, if you will, of seed oil.
sure. I would say that I wrote this paper with the idea that economists are not paying attention at all to dietary fat as a determinant of health. And so this is just trying to bring that idea into economics because I think there's a lot of good that economists can do with the knowledge that they have to try to remedy the problem. So,
Yes. So someone might say, well, what do economists have to say about this? This seems like a, a, a health issue. And so obviously you've already laid the groundwork a little bit for why that the information and the different incentives that are in play in production and consumption and all of those things. Could you briefly kind of walk us through what some people might have found related to how seed oils might be bad for your health and some how they might be good for your health or
sure.
neutral?
So I'll start with the good side. So the good side is that they unambiguously reduce blood cholesterol levels, and that's been replicated time and again, and in particular LDL cholesterol levels. So that was kind of at the center of the diet heart hypothesis. That's why saturated fat became demonized, was because if you eat more saturated fat in your diet, you're going to have higher LDL cholesterol levels. And actually, at the time of the diet heart hypothesis, it was not even known that there were subtypes of cholesterol. It was just, they were just looking at total cholesterol.
Right.
Um, but as time has gone on, people have realized that there's even different subtypes of LDL cholesterol. And so the negative side of the seed oils is that, yes, they reduce the total LDL count, but they increase or fail to decrease a particular type of LDL, which oxidizes easily and which can uh, cause inflammation of the blood cells of the blood vessels, and then from there can cause the blockages that promote heart disease. So that's kind of the essence of it, is that these omega-6 polyunsaturated fats are pro-inflammatory, and so they're going to cause issues. And there's other people who have, I don't know how strong the evidence is on this avenue, but there's also people arguing that these omega-6 seed oils they're promoting insulin resistance. So, and that has to do more with how the body metabolism works. So I can get into that some more, or if you want to go to a different question, we can do
Yeah,
that.
no. So I've walked us away a little bit from the obesity angle just because I kind of wanted to just interested in some of what is the good and bad health implications there. So you're not in what you're doing, you're not really wanting to say much about that. That's kind of a background. How did we get here? Why are
Yeah, I
seed
mean, I
oils
would
taking
say
off?
it's just context for people who
Yeah,
aren't
context.
familiar with this type of stuff,
Of
which I
course.
wasn't until about 6 months ago.
Right. Um, so so why obesity? What role do you think seed oils are playing in obesity?
Yeah, so for that, according to the books that I've read, which seem to be reputable, so the main book that I'm thinking of is called Omega Balance by Anthony Holbert. He's an Australian zoologist and has done a lot of stuff on at the cellular level. Like there's a lot of cell biology that if you understand a little bit about it can be helpful for understanding this whole line of argument. Um, I forgot the rest of your question. I'm sorry.
No, I was just asking, the role that you think seed oils play in obesity.
Yeah, okay. Tony Holbert has written this book, and it talks about the different ways that seed oils could promote obesity. So, for one, they seem to. So, I think key here with the inflammation angle is oxidation. So, we hear about how antioxidants are good for you because they're anti-inflammatory. So, if you have your cells that are or these seed oils are causing sort of greater amounts of oxidation in your cells, and then that can cause problems, particularly with fat cells. So it can cause the fat cells to grow in size, which would be directly related to obesity. And it can also, my understanding is for younger children and youth, the number of fat cells can increase. So the first thing I said is called hypertrophy, where the cell grows in size, and then the number of cells growing is called hyperplasia, and those two together can explain why there might be more body fat if you're ingesting a lot of these seed oils. Now, obviously, there's going to be individual differences in how your particular body is going to react to these things, and so um, a lot of the experiments that have been done, there we do a lot of experiments on animals to try to understand these biochemical pathways. But then there's like limited ability to actually deploy them onto humans for the various reasons that we're all familiar with. That
Right.
you can't always run an experiment.
Yeah.
Not that there haven't been experiments done that have supported this, but that's kind of where things stand on the obesity angle.
So you have a mechanism by which you think this would translate seed oils into obesity. Um, so I think if you ask most people, they would say people are eating too much, they're not exercising.
Yep.
Um, Lots of people like to attack sugar, stuff like that. Where's there room for seed oils to fit in the explanation, given like those three or four things that are our favorite explanations for obesity?
Yeah. I mean, I think I would say the most mainstream argument now is that it's processed foods,
Right.
but that's not particularly helpful because you don't know what the particular pathway is. So what I would say is I forgot your question again. I'm sorry.
So if I advise somebody just avoid processed foods,
Yes, that's okay.
like they'll lose weight. And you're
Yes,
saying, but that doesn't explain why they would lose weight because we'd be cutting out all types of things. I might just eat less food. I might eat less sugar. I might, might be something fundamental about the food and the way it's processed, which I think is part of where seed oils fits in, if I'm understanding that.
exactly. Yeah. So so I would say like I don't think it's sugar per se, just by itself because you see that, you know, consumption of sugar by Americans has actually plummeted over the last 25 years.
Do we have an idea why?
I think just people understood that high fructose corn syrup was bad and they tried to stay away from it.
Yeah.
And maybe there's been some incentives for the food producers to switch to these, artificial sweeteners or whatever, or to make sort of low calorie, diet versions of a lot of products. But that would just be responding to the consumer incentives to not have them, right? And maybe, people's doctors have been telling them, you're diabetic, you need to stop eating sugar.
Right.
And so people have responded. But they're not saying you're diabetic, you need to stop eating seed oils.
Right.
And so the seed oil consumption has just continued to increase basically linearly,
Right.
hand in hand with obesity rates.
So sugar has plummeted. So that makes it really difficult for me to make some kind of case that sugar is principally driving obesity.
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard with just looking at this time series data because you could say, well, maybe the real model is sugar consumption above some minimal level
Right.
interacted with seed oil consumption.
Right.
and you wouldn't be able to reject that hypothesis.
Right.
So, even I'm reticent to say that it's definitely seed oils and can only be seed oils. But at the same time, I see a huge blind spot in the literature in economics that's ignoring dietary fat
Yeah.
and basically the state of the art, as far as I understand it, in health economics right now is just that it's all about calories,
Right.
which is
So
not particularly
so could it
helpful.
be I'm eating less sugar, but I'm just eating more food? What about the calorie angle?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as I can tell from the data available, calorie consumption is basically flat over the last 25 years.
Really?
And possibly it's because sugar's gone down and it's so maybe we're eating less sugar but eating more mass of food.
Right.
I don't really know. There are lots of theories out there about how the brain perceives satiety. You've got these GLP-1 drugs that are on the market now that
And this is
are
Ozempic. Is that what you're
exactly or Wegovy or all there's probably like 10 of them
I
on the
didn't know that.
market and they're going to inhibit some of that appetite and make people feel less hungry. They're not going to eat as much. They're going to lose weight.
So is
Right.
that principally what those are? Is just appetite suppression or
Uh, you know, I think people are still trying to understand what exactly they are. But for sure, a commonly reported experience is that you take these drugs and then you don't feel as hungry. You feel
right.
full more quickly. So you can't, maybe you used to clear your whole plate at a meal and then now you can only eat like half of it. So that has something to do with satiety and
That
appetite signaling.
that rings true to me. You're a pretty fit guy. I don't know what your fitness of choice is, but I've gone through different phases of intentionally gaining weight to try to put on muscle because I like lifting and whatnot. And then, but you got to offset that by cutting weight sometimes. And my appetite changes dramatically. Like it takes me a while. Okay, I got to go through a phase where I'm losing weight. It like takes a while for my appetite to adjust that no, we're not eating that amount of food. And it comes down and it gets more bearable. And then I get the reverse. Right now, I want to lift heavy and I want to try to gain some muscle, so I'm going to bulk a little bit. And like being able to just eat as much food as I need to get in the protein targets that I want to get to, it literally can become a challenge for a little while
Yeah.
until my appetite adjusts. So I mean that makes a lot of intuitive sense to me.
Yeah. And then, I mean, there's other evidence that the seed oils mess up with that appetite signaling mechanism as well.
Okay. So
Um,
the seed oils are doing what then? The seed oils are messing with like my satiety, like how full I feel, or how's
yeah.
it?
So there's something called endocannabinoids that your body produces that would signal, and it's from the same root word as cannabis.
Uh,
So basically the argument is that if you eat seed oils, you'll feel hungrier
okay.
later. And for the same reason that if you take marijuana, then you're going to feel hungrier later.
Interesting. Okay. So um most of the time I would expect I eat food and that quenches my appetite and then I'm good until my body uses all that fuel. And you're saying, but one potential, I think you said potential mechanism is that seed oils mess with that and then I get hungrier sooner, or when I get hungry, I get more hungry than I might otherwise have been.
Yeah, so kind of the main study on that was done on mice, um, showing basically feeding them the amount of seed oils that the typical American has now versus the amount that they had in 1900, and then seeing what happened to the mice, and so they were able to track the different receptors of this endocannabinoid system to see what was being activated, and so they found the evidence for this pathway. Obviously, that was just one study, and this is a burgeoning theory, I would say, from what I've read.
Could while we're on the animal thing, can you discuss some of the ways you had some interesting evidence in there about uh, the way that we see seed oil is being used in and with animals?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I think another data point in favor of the argument that I'm laying out in this paper is the way that you fatten up livestock to sell at a higher price at market is you feed them seed oils, basically, or, husks from soybean oil production. So the way the production of these oils works is that you get the plants in, you process them, and there's different byproducts that can be used for different purposes, very similar to petroleum processing, where, at one level I have my natural gas, at another level I have my jet fuel, my automobile fuel, etc. So it's a similar thing where, you can have an ethanol plant for converting corn into ethanol for automobiles, and then at the same time they can be producing corn oil for consumers and sending the nibs of the corn kernels out to feed pigs. So it really is a testament to capitalist incentives for preserving food and trying to make use of every
Yes.
bit of the plant. So there's no fault there. It's just, I think there's a general lack of knowledge about the consequences, or the potential consequences.
Yeah, there's Econ 101 efficiency discussion to be had, right? I could use this as an example in day one micro about efficiency. So if I talk to a rancher or somebody who's running a feedlot or something, and I said, okay, tell me about what you're feeding these animals to try to maximize how big they can get so that you're getting the most for each animal. Um, they would just say, yeah, we feed them the seed oil or seed
I
oil.
mean, I don't know that they would call it seed oils, but
No, they
they would
wouldn't, but
call it
whatever.
grain feed.
Yeah. And they would be like, the this fattens them up the best.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's also cheaper,
Right.
because you don't have to have them grazing on the field. You don't have to round them up.
Well, I can't do
Uh,
a feedlot without that kind of thing, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you can take grass in and just dump it in front of them, but I don't know what the shelf stability is on that relative to the grain feed. And, I'm not an
Yeah.
agricultural scientist.
So at the risk of getting too far afield, um, I'm not feeding them seed oils. I'm feeding them grains. But
Yeah, I
you're
mean, you're
saying
still
this is an
feeding them the
argument.
seeds.
It
Yeah.
is. Okay.
So the Tony Holbert's book, Omega Balance, which I recommend everyone read who wants to really learn
Put a
about
link in
this.
the show description.
Um, it basically gives you this rule of thumb that omega 3s come from plants, omega 6s come from seeds. There are some exceptions to that. So flaxseed and chia seed are very high in omega 3. But then basically every other seed is high in omega 6. And then the plants, so typically we think of fish oils as being omega 3, but that's because the fish are eating the plankton, which are like a plant. So basically, a lot of the omega 3 is just coming from photosynthesis in the chlorophyll of plants. And it's got some really important, uh, it plays some important roles in our body's functioning. And so the whole idea of that book is that you want to be in balance. So you want to have like a 50-50 ratio of omega 3 to omega 6, whereas like the current diet in the US is like 90% omega 6 to 10% omega 3, or even worse.
So this is not an argument for me to like avoid grains altogether or something like this.
I mean, you should eat what you like to eat. I would say if you're looking for like a rank ordered, this is the worst thing to eat versus not as bad, definitely deep fried foods in seed oils, I would say is like the number one. And then any sort of just like pure drinking of the seed oils, which you might think that sounds funny, but they're basically the base of a lot of salad dressings. So if
Okay.
you get a salad at a restaurant and you pour the ranch dressing on or whatever, that's going to basically be soybean oil that you're pouring on the salad. So I think those are kind of the two big ones. But then there's like, if I want to have some pistachios or almonds for a snack, you're going to be getting some of these omega 6s, but maybe they're not as bad because they're in a format that humans have been consuming for a while. And to get the same amount of seed oil out of pistachios, you have to eat a lot of them, like probably a lot more than you would be.
Actually eat. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas like a tablespoon of corn oil is like eating the equivalent of 40 corn cobs or something. I
Right.
don't know the exact ratio, but it's like way
Something
out of
like that.
balance.
So let me return. I think you made a very compelling case for why you don't think sugar can be causing the trend that we see in obesity. And then you talked about why, a blanket condemnation of processed foods probably falls short. Um, I I detoured you a little too much when we were doing the calories thing because I- if you if I just showed a graph and it was just calories and um obesity just hand in hand, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. It's
Yeah.
just like people
Yeah.
just eat too much. And you started to say like calories are just kind of flat. And we discussed some of the reasons for that. So talk about that a little bit as your motivation for why seed oils.
Yeah. I mean, basically, my understanding of human metabolism is that it's not, our body doesn't consume calories. We have mitochondria in our cells that are converting energy in the food to ATP, which is the energy currency of the body. So I don't know how informative it is to say, okay, well, I just ate 500 calories, but like the body doesn't, you'd want to be consuming ATP units, but there's a conversion process. And so the efficiency of that conversion process is going to result in a different amount of energy utilization for the same amount of food, depending on how efficient your mitochondria are.
So
So
if I
that's
eat,
kind of where the calories in, calories out is oversimplified, in my opinion.
I see. So if I eat two different compositions that both give me 500 calories, that doesn't necessarily result in the same amount of energy available to my system.
That's my understanding. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, so that's actually one of the questions I was gonna ask. Because if you follow, uh, let me say, popular advice, people that are in um, the spheres giving people advice on how to lose weight. I mean, they love to boil it down to just calorie in, calorie out, and they get people on their podcast or their YouTube show, and they say, I just can't lose weight, and they're like, well, you're either eating too much or you're not working out enough. Um, and you're saying that's just too simplistic.
Yeah. I mean, the whole uh, quandary with obesity is that someone who's got a lot of fat on their body, that's a source of energy for the body, but it's choosing not to do that, not to use it for its energy and instead use it from the food. So we call that metabolic flexibility when the body can easily toggle between different energy sources for its energy needs. And so the problem with obesity quite clearly is that there's some malfunction of that metabolic flexibility.
Mm.
And so the question is, well, why is it and how do we fix it? And so, if you want another interesting read, I would recommend Kate Shanahan's Dark Calories, which came out about 3 or 4 months ago. And she kind of lays out how the seed oils can sort of cause problems for the mitochondria. And then that can lead the body to thinking that it shouldn't be using the body fat as the fuel source and
Uh,
instead prefer sugar as the fuel source. And then that can cause someone to feel more hungry, even though they have excess fat to burn. And then that can sort of spiral and create a spiral of what we call type 2 diabetes, where the,
okay,
the
so
body's calling for more sugar, um, and then it just keeps rising.
somebody who wants to challenge you on the calorie in, calorie out thing is going to say, it's just basic energy expenditure kind of thing. And you're saying but it's related to what's happening with the metabolism. And so I could be eating in a relatively healthy range of calories, but I could have this, what do you call it, metabolic flexibility. I could have that messed up to a point where I would still get bad outcomes in terms of obesity.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, um, I think that the people who are really obese, who have a lot of extra fat to burn, they would even find it hard to like even do like an intermittent fasting
Huh.
thing because the body has such a dependency on the sugar. And so it's like if I don't eat every 2 hours, I'm gonna have a blood sugar crash. I'm gonna start feeling woozy.
And they can't just power through that. They can't just, it's not a matter of
That's my
willpower.
understanding. Like I've never been in that situation personally, but that's my understanding from what the Dark Calories book is arguing. And I should say that some of the stuff in that book is not entirely correct in my opinion. And so, take it with a grain of salt, but
Right.
I think it's a compelling argument for how seed oils could be behind both obesity and diabetes.
Obesity and diabetes. Okay, so let me levy one more challenge if I were the calorie in, calorie out defender. I'd say, well, okay, maybe you have some good points on the nutrition side, but there's two elements. There's also calorie out. People are just more sedentary now, and they don't work out and they sit and they watch Netflix. Uh, how would you respond to that kind of challenge?
Yeah, I would just point them to Herman Pontzer's work. So he wrote a book called Burn that came out 3 or 4 years ago, where he went and he tracked hunter gatherers in Tanzania named the Hadza and measured their energy output very meticulously with something called doubly labeled water. And then he did the same thing with some Western, typical Western people in either the UK or the US, and basically found that, adjusted for body weight differences, that they're basically burning the same amount of calories. And so the question is, well, how can a hunter gatherer people that's walking 9 miles a day be burning the same number of calories as someone who's sitting on their couch playing video games? And the answer is that it seems that the body regulates energy out as a coping mechanism so that it doesn't starve to death. And so that to me is a pretty compelling piece of evidence that there's more going on than what we think. And so this kind of translates to the fitness people that you follow on social media because they're like, well, I just ate this much fish and rice or whatever. Now I'm going to go pound out a 2 hour workout, and that's going to be 500 calories that I'm going to burn off. And actually, the case is that it's not linear like that. You can't just add on. It's like, okay, well, I ran a half marathon. Now, if I go lift some weights, that'll be another 200 calories off. That doesn't seem to be how it works.
So is this related to like a metabolism type thing, or is this related to uh like how much people move around um for non-exercise, right? So
Neat.
the the exercise science literature call it non-exercise activity thermogenesis, right? Like I just tap my fingers or bounce my knee, that kind of thing. And once I read about that, I saw it everywhere, and including in myself. So like I'm trying to lose weight, and all of a sudden I find that when I'm sitting down, I'm just much more still.
Yep.
Is that the kind of thing you have in mind, or are you talking about something more, what would you say, at the molecular level?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's been a little while since I read that book, but my understanding is that basically the body has these background processes that it can sort of increase or decrease in response to whatever exercise is happening. So like basal metabolism, I think is pretty much fixed. It's like what's it doing
Right.
outside of basal metabolism? And so if I have a habit of like walking 5 miles a day, then it's going to downregulate some other process that would be using energy
Right.
as a way to conserve energy. And then on the flip side, if I'm just sitting on my couch all day, then it's going to upregulate some things that aren't as important because there's like nothing else to work on.
Right. So there's some, I don't call mixed evidence, but there's some different potential mechanisms for seed oils having good or bad health effects. Several of which you've highlighted as to potential negatives: inflammation, metabolism, would you say disruption? Um,
Endocannabinoids.
right, messing with our appetite, um, literally causing us to have more and bigger fat cells.
Hmm.
So we could see all these plausible negative things. So I think if you've been convincing to the audience, which I find all of these arguments compelling, of course, as an economist, an argument that goes, well, calories are flat, exercise is up, or you didn't say exercise, but
Physical activity,
physical
whatever.
activity is
I mean,
up, sugar
gym
is down.
memberships,
Sorry, go ahead.
gym memberships are up if you want to
Right,
use that as a measure.
right. Um, but seed oils and obesity are the two things that we've listed here that are moving together, and find that pretty compelling.
And yeah, in spite of all the other changes.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, so I think the next thing comes to, well, if all this is true, how can it be that these things are being used in food products? And so we've talked to you've hinted at this information and economic incentives angle. Can you kind of talk us through what the broad categories of that are so we can kind of get into that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think it starts with scientists like Ansel Keys. They're sort of the researchers that are providing the initial information. Um, Food producers are going to be basically responding to consumer demand. And so they're going to have a vested interest in the information that the consumer gets. And then pharmaceutical companies are also going to indirectly influence what consumers are given as dietary advice because they might have incentives for consumers to take a particular pharmaceutical substance to remedy a symptom when maybe it could be solved through some non-pharmaceutical means. So I would say the big players are food and drug companies and government. Um, and then government is sort of taking its cues from the scientific literature and scientists who are on prominent government advisory boards. So if you want to read an interesting history of how we got the food guidelines that have been in the U.S. for the last 40 or 50 years, you could look at Nina Teicholz's The Big Fat Surprise. That kind of walks through a lot of the science history to get us to where we were. So the government's using its information from the scientists and the food and drug company lobbying to give the consumers advice on dietary recommendations. The government's also choosing which research projects to fund. So if the government doesn't think that seed oils are a big deal, then it's not going to fund, they're not going to use NIH or NSF grants on those projects. The food and drug companies are also directly funding scientific research to suit their own means. And so you've got this complex interaction of political economy incentives. And then on the consumer side, there's going to be preferences for cheaper food. There's going to be preferences for food that is, more palatable, as they say, which is I can eat more of it. I get some instantaneous pleasure from consuming this food. So broccoli that's been steamed maybe doesn't have that property.
Right. Okay. This is a good argument. I want to ask, I want to interject here a little bit just because of, to be honest, a personal. Do, do seed oil foods, like, do they taste better? Here's the reason I
I
ask.
don't think so.
Yeah, okay. So you're on the same page with me. Um, so I'm married to the farmer's daughter. Um, and she recently got into making her own tallow, as farmers' daughters are wont to do. And she made for our family fries and uh, um fried chicken from this, and literally our consumption, our desire to go out to eat at fried chicken restaurants like went to zero overnight because it's not the same product.
Yep.
I find this on one hand, like potato chips, probably a classic example of okay, so I can just sit and eat potato. So I get it. I'm not really saying, um, but what did you say? They're the not the monosaturated, but the saturated fats
Polyunsaturated.
come from animal products, right?
Well, so every fat that you see, like butter, for
Yes.
example, is going to have some mixture of all three types of fat,
Okay.
saturated,
Oh, okay.
unsaturated, polyunsaturated.
So,
But it's sort of like what's the dominant component. So in animal products, it's going to be saturated fat.
but what's happening there that it's not obvious to me that seed oil based foods are more tasty. In fact, I think that might be the opposite.
Yeah, so I think it comes back to this idea. I was about to get to it about just consumption path dependence or developing a taste for a particular food.
Yes.
So the maybe the food that you ate as a kid, that's particularly reminiscent, and so you whatever you eat as a kid is going to kind of stick with you and be
Right.
habit forming. So I think that's where the angle comes in with the food, and also if you've never had tallow fries, you don't know that there's anything different out there.
Right. That's a
But
good
you
argument.
do know that going to McDonald's and getting their fries with your Happy Meal is, something that's easier than having mom cook it yourself or whatever.
So I'm asking to speculate a little. It seems to me the convenience thing is a huge factor. It's like the price is
Yep.
lower, and then it's just I can't just go order a thing of tallow fries. If any fries that are available to me in the next 10 minutes, those are seed oil fried.
Yep.
So in your estimation, is that like a consumption incentive side, or is that really rooted in more the production
Yeah, I
side?
mean, you know very well these things are determined in equilibrium.
Of course.
So it's hard to suss out what's what. I mean, obviously Procter and Gamble when they made Crisco, they wanted to aggressively advertise it to try to turn it into this path dependent situation. And so they gave out cookbooks where the recipes were all in there with substituted lard for
Right.
Crisco so that people would start cooking with it. So that was for sure like a premeditated marketing campaign, though I don't know that they thought that this might be harmful to human health. They're just trying to, and to the economists in the audience, there's a production possibilities frontier for every economy. And
Yes.
if we spend more resources on animal based fats, then we're giving something else up. And
Yeah.
so it does seem to be that there is a trade off here between economic production writ large
Yeah.
and consuming these products that are animal based that seem to be better for us. And I shouldn't say animal based, I should say just saturated fats
Right.
because you can get it from coconut or palm as well.
Right. So if I go out and start my own fried chicken company that's doing everything in tallow,
Mm-hmm.
I might have success on the front of people might taste that and then prefer that, but I'm going to face trouble from the other direction where people are going to say, well, you're eating things made in tallow or lard and like that's bad for your health. So you talked about that a couple times, this sort of information on people's dietary choices. I remember growing up thinking like lard and these things were bad for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's what we were taught. I assume you're a similar age to me,
Yeah, you
child
and I
of
must
the
almost be the
80s.
exact same age, I would guess. But um, can you discuss that a little bit and how you view that? How much is government? How much is drug companies? How much is I mean, it could even be the restaurants and the food production, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably the best way to think about this is in terms of the trans fat phenomenon.
Right.
So, you know, we're cruising along. We're using Crisco. We're still eating stuff in tallow. This is pre-World War II. Then the 1950s come along. Heart disease is rising, and saturated fat becomes the bad guy because of the cholesterol effect that I already mentioned. So then food companies are like, well, how do we still make delicious food that we were using saturated fat to produce
Mm.
now that we can't use it because it's being demonized? And it's like, okay, well, we have to figure out a way to get that same sort of solid form without actually using a saturated fat. And so then they use partial hydrogenation. And it turns out that partially hydrogenated vegetable oils are really versatile in different food productions. So there's a massive uptake in it. In the 1960s, there's a huge, like tripling in the consumption of soybean oil. And it just takes off from there. And so basically, from like the early 60s to the, I don't know, late 90s, it's basically trans fat central for all these processed foods because not only are the consumers aware, but there's also like consumer advocacy groups. So there's a guy named Phil Sokoloff, who was a millionaire that took out full page ads telling McDonald's to stop using beef tallow,
Oh,
basically, in its fries. And so McDonald's had to relent. And so they basically changed from tallow to a trans fat based blend. And then eventually the evidence piles up that trans fats aren't great. And then we have the same process again. And now there's even more incentive to use these vegetable oils in different forms because now you've taken away saturated fat and trans fats. So you got to come up with some other way to get that same texture or same properties
right.
for the food manufacturers. So that's going to be coming in the form of now we got to like mix, we got to kind of Frankenstein a bunch of different vegetable oils and like palm or coconut oil, something that's saturated to try to get back to what we had before. So that kind of shows the evolution of how these things evolve. And I think the food manufacturers, I don't know that I don't see any like twirling mustache villainry. I think they're just sort of trying to sell product
Yeah,
and look good, and they're following the guidelines that
yeah.
the medical and the scientific literature is telling them.
It's too bad. That'd make a better story. The food
I mean, there's
product
people out there that
would
are
think that.
portraying such, but I don't agree with it.
So you mentioned the trend in heart disease is motivating this a lot. Do you know what it's done since we've moved towards these seed oils? Like, is it, you mentioned a potential benefit for LDL cholesterol and seed, like, have we stemmed the tide on heart disease doing this?
I mean, I don't think so. It's with heart disease, it's hard because there's been so many medical innovations to
Right,
cope with it, whereas there haven't been as many with obesity.
right.
But now that the GLP-1 drugs are out, all bets are off with what that's going to do. So
Right.
we could see declines in obesity,
Yeah,
in the next decade, but we're still
yeah,
not solving the
yeah.
problem.
Regardless of what happens with dietary choices.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
And
and so I mean, I think most economists would say let's actually solve the ultimate cause, not the
yes,
proximate cause
right,
at an additional $10 trillion price point.
right. Yeah, you don't have to go down this path with me, but I am exceedingly suspicious of the cholesterol and heart disease narrative for the types of reasons that we've discussed today. So I guess I'm not all the way out on the limb, but I'm pretty far out there. So
Yeah, I mean
I
the American Heart Association is still, as of today, recommending that you consume a lot of these
yeah,
omega-6 oils
yeah.
for heart health.
It goes without saying, neither of us are doctors and none of this is medical advice. So we're just having a discussion about economics. Um, I'm kind of interested into turning towards counter arguments and alternative explanations. Unless there's something in the incentives discussion that I overlooked that you wanted.
No, I think we pretty well covered it.
So, uh, let's take a look at, maybe some alternative explanations. I already tried my best with calorie in, calorie out, and you seem to have defeated me. Um, so like, what are some interesting potential alternative explanations that you would consider?
Yeah, I would say so. A book I read this summer is called Good Energy by Callie and Casey. Casey and Callie Means, sorry. Um, and they basically talk about a lot of other stuff in addition to vegetable oils. So things like phthalates and these basically there's like a lot of substances that are in our food and packaging and that we interact with on a day-to-day basis that are known to disrupt hormone regulation and such.
Is this like endocrine disruptor, or are we talking
Exactly,
about something?
yeah.
Okay, okay.
So, you know, uh the only one that's coming to mind right now is like BPA, which,
Yeah.
you know, there were the when we were younger, there were the Nalgene bottle craze,
Yes.
and then that had BPA in it, and now it's like everything's BPA free.
Yes.
Um, so there's PFAS, which is like some other bad things. So there's kind of another group of people that are promoting this hypothesis that it's coming from some environmental contaminant or food additive. So like food dyes, for example.
Yeah.
And to me, it's not clear what the relative contribution might be of those things relative to seed oils
So these are not,
to causing our health problems.
you're saying these are alternative explanations as opposed to like complementary ones.
Yeah, I mean they could be complementary as well.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I just don't know enough, and I don't think there's really good enough data
Right.
to really show convincing. I mean, there's certainly not like the figure that I have in the paper where it's charting obesity next to the seed oil supply, where it's like clearly this one-to-one thing. You know, these things are harder to measure, and the dose makes the poison, and
Yes.
you don't always know what the dose is because
Yeah.
they're not required to label it because of FDA regulation. So
So that goes back to your information idea, right?
yeah,
Is eh, like I said, this is a thing that I've sort of and been into is kind of a strong word, but I like to flip around the nutrition label and see which things have soybean oil in them, which is all of them.
yeah,
Um, and you kind of got to know what you're looking for. And sometimes things have multiple names, like you mentioned, linoleic acid,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that,
Linoleic acid is kind of the main
yeah,
problematic fatty acid that is causing the problems that we talked about.
yeah. And so you kind of remove some things. Um, it takes like a lot of, I don't know what the word I want, but uh, uh, I kind of got to have some knowledge to even know what I'm looking at, right? And so
Yeah,
I could look at
exactly.
these things and not know what is BPA and what's not. BPA is not a good example because there's kind of been a little movement to be BPA free, and they advertise that and show those kind of things. And you mentioned something else. What'd you call this? Phthalates,
Yeah, phthalates,
phthalates.
um,
Okay.
and also PFAS. I'm not an expert on these particular things to know more about. I just know that they have been shown to inhibit metabolism. So
So,
if the argument is, well, we're becoming more obese, we're gaining more weight because of some failure of metabolism, then the question is, well, what exact substance is causing that? And it could be seed oils, it could be other stuff, but it seems to me that the increase over time in seed oils makes it a top contender, but I'm not discounting the potential role of these other ones.
interesting. And does this include the lithium stuff, or it
Yeah,
doesn't?
exactly. So that'd be another example of like some contaminant in the water. Um, so yeah, so if anyone's interested, there's a anonymous or pseudonymous blog called Slime Mold Time Mold that has like a whole series on obesity, and their favorite hypothesis is that there's lithium in the food supply that's sort of unmeasured and in trace amounts. But if you get that exposure over a long period of time, then it can cause you to gain weight.
And so this would have that the lithium hypothesis might be better than uh, the seed oil or the other contaminants argument if it explains why different geographies would have different
Yeah,
obesity rates.
exactly. So yeah, so there's some geographic variation in obesity, and so that would point more to an environmental than a food supply at the aggregate level issue. But then my argument would be, well, like every state in the US has gotten quite a bit heavier over the
Right.
past 20 years. So it's probably a mix of both.
Right. Now we're back to things happening on the margin versus interaction effects, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Um, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, since we're a week removed from the election. People talk about fluoride in the water as related to this. It's not an obesity thing.
I haven't read much about that, so I don't really have an opinion.
I know some of the discussion about RFK Jr. potentially getting a cabinet position has brought up the fluoride stuff. So
Yeah, well, I mean, from what I've seen, the the people who are not in favor of the incoming administration are worried about a lot of wholesale changes being made by RFK Jr. And so I don't know what to say about that other than we'll have to wait and see.
yeah, there's nothing to be said there. So we've talked about the geographic variation. We've talked about the different contaminants. Those are at least interesting. For maybe uh the non-professional economists in our audience, could you explain why the geographic variation across the country might be a problem for your theory?
Sure. Basically, if you think about Colorado, uh, state with the lowest obesity rate versus West Virginia, state with the highest obesity rate as of the numbers that are in my paper. The question is, are people really eating fewer seed oils in Colorado than in West Virginia? Especially when if you actually walk into a Whole Foods or a Trader Joe's, you're going to find a lot of seed oils in the
Okay.
products there. Um, so that's something that we actually don't really have great data on, period. Um, at least not yet. And so it's hard to know what else would be explaining the differences. It could be, the healthy people move to Colorado away from West Virginia.
Yeah,
So
the
there could be
select.
selective migration explaining things. Um, David Cutler and his co-authors have a recent paper about place-based health effects that kind of talks about how there's persistent differences in smoking and obesity across different areas of the US and that translates into differences in mortality. So they call it health capital
Yeah.
or human capital. So
A
that
lot
would
of that
kind of
could be
be the
cultural,
argument
right?
there. Yeah, exactly. So
Like maybe I just, we could take it to the tobacco thing. Uh, if I'm a person in West Virginia, I might just culturally be more attached to smoking a cigarette than the person who wants to go out and hike every Saturday in Colorado, right?
yeah. So yeah,
Well, and it's
exactly.
interesting because you mentioned this earlier, and I almost said this because you were talking about the salad and the salad dressing. Like I'm born and raised Texan. Like I don't eat salads unless they have ranch dressing on them, right? And so uh, maybe this goes part of the way to explaining your geographic variation because your seed oil data that you show in the paper is national,
Yeah.
right? And so you see this trend overall, but that doesn't explain how much it's consumed or not being consumed. That it's pretty ubiquitous. So if we had to guess, probably just not that much variation how many seed oils are being taken in.
That's what my guess would be. I mean, obviously, there's papers in the Quarterly Journal of Economics talking about food deserts that actually show that even like at the zip code level, there's quite different purchasing decisions in the healthfulness of
Huh.
the grocery basket. But then the issue there is that what's defined as healthy is actually by government fiat. And so the the FDA or the USDA is saying, okay, in the NHANES, which is the main survey for health economists to monitor people's health in the US. So in that data set, they create a variable called the healthy eating index. It's based on the foods that the respondent reports eating in the last 24 hours or the last week. And that healthy eating index basically says you should limit your saturated fat and
Uh-huh.
increase your PUFA. But then it also just doesn't really make a difference between mono or polyunsaturated or omega-3 or omega-6.
So for your purposes, useless then.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would want to actually get the actual ingredient list of the
Right.
products that were purchased and reported. So, so I don't know if in the NHANES, I don't think you can get the exact foods that they reported. They just sort of tell you what's the dietary index. But
Right.
then these other economists that have looked at food deserts, they actually get the like basically the grocery store receipts, and then they can map like what was the exact barcode of every item you purchased, and then you could map that to a food ingredient database,
Huh.
at least to some extent, and then you could figure out what's the actual seed oil content of these things.
So I get some measurement from this survey, and it's based on what? Like the food pyramid, or
Yeah, something like that. Whatever the recommendations are. So,
and the food
limit
pyramid
saturated
likes us
fat intake.
and the food pyramid likes us to eat lots of grains, which you've already discussed as a potential issue.
Yeah, I mean, and even processed grains go hand in
Right.
hand with seed oils as well. So like if you go down an aisle in the supermarket, the only bread that you could buy that doesn't have seed oils in it is a sourdough bread.
Yeah.
And that one is gonna basically what I've learned is that the bread that has seed oils in it is gonna have a lot longer shelf life than
Right.
the bread that doesn't. But then I don't really like the taste of the seed oil bread because it even if it's not moldy, it's not like
Yes.
tasting great.
Right.
So that's just saying that, there's a lot of these products that, refined carbohydrates plus seed oils plus sugar is kind of like the backbone of all processed foods.
So in your survey, it's not going to differentiate between you eat sourdough and I eat the the other type of bread.
I mean, I've actually not dug into that
Okay.
particular data source to that extent to know the answer, but my sense is that they report the food logs to the people that are collecting the data, and then the data collectors then aggregate it into some score of health from 0 to 100 or whatever the scale is. And then to get a higher points on this healthy index, you have to eat fewer saturated fats.
Which ties all the way back into the stuff you were talking about with the dietary information and what the
Exactly.
government plays a role in. So how are people getting this information? People don't go look on some website. I'm sure these websites exist. How are people
I mean, you
getting?
can go to Reddit for sure.
Yeah, right. I'm
There's an
getting stuff
active
from
Reddit
social media,
community.
from what's being posted on my Facebook by my friends, my carefully curated Instagram feed, which maybe yours and mine looks different than the average person. I don't know. Uh, People literally go to Reddit and ask advice about
Yep. All
these things.
kinds of stuff.
Yeah. And you can probably get two entirely different, right? I can go to Moms Against Red 40 and get a totally different set of nutritional advice than I would against whatever mainstream government approved nutritional advice Reddit. I don't know what that one would be called, but
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, people need to experiment on themselves,
yeah,
but that takes a lot of discipline and a lot of effort to
yes.
actually do a controlled experiment on yourself.
And
Um,
the informational stuff you're talking about is really, really hard,
yeah,
right? Like if I want to, like you said, self-experiment, which is just an obvious thing, right? That's just obvious. That should be a thing that people do. See how let's take something less controversial, something more or less dairy in my diet and see how I feel, or more or less um more or less uh, breads that have gluten in them, and so see how I feel
Yeah.
those kind of things. Those things kind of straightforward. The type of stuff that you're talking about today, that might be really difficult. One, difficult to avoid. Two, difficult to do
Yeah, well, and
situation.
then any kind of like group meal that you're going to want to participate in, that's going to have seed oils in it. And so that can make it hard to stick to your regimen for the purposes of the experiment.
Right.
So, I think the internet's mature to the point where you can find sub communities that
Mhm.
talk about this stuff. If you're looking to make a change,
Yeah.
uh, they're willing to give you advice, and you can just see for yourself, how do you feel after you eat this or that.
Yeah.
Uh,
So there might be an obvious problem with that though, like how I feel in the short term might not relate very well to how
yeah,
how obese I get 10 years from now.
and it gets a little bit back to what you were saying about how your appetite sort of changes based on the mode that you're in. And so, because a lot of the hunger signals that we get are sort of programmed by circadian rhythm. So like every day around noon or 1 o'clock, my body's like, okay, it's time to eat.
Yeah.
Um, but then like transitioning to a new regimen
Yeah.
is the hard part. But then once you're in that new regimen, it sort of adapts to it.
So you mentioned before, I- this could be um this could be something that might be really difficult actually. You mentioned intermittent fasting or something like that. And so I could change my rhythm. Almost everybody listening to this will have had some kind of experience similar to this, where just something in my life changed. And now I go through a period of time where I don't eat lunch or I eat dinner 2 hours later than I used to eat dinner. So, right. I start taking the kids to soccer practice. And now we don't get home till 7 when we used to eat at 5 or something like that.
Hmm.
It'll be rough for a minute and then you'll adjust to it. But if we're talking about obesity, you're saying that adds layers of difficulty for that kind of
Yeah, I mean, it's hard
individual.
to run a randomized controlled trial
Yes.
that would reveal this when the effect is taking so long. And that kind of gets back to, the fundamental issue with the seed oil, sussing that out is if you eat more of this linoleic acid, it's going to end up in your stored body fat. And the your fat cells turn over so infrequently that it's kind of going to be trapped in there until you burn it off. And then
Right.
when you burn it off, it's going to possibly cause damage in the form of oxidation because it's actually trying to be used for energy.
Right.
And so it can be really, to actually properly do a trial that would show what's happening, you'd have to take years and you'd have to make sure
Yeah.
that everyone's fully compliant. And so back in the 60s, when the diet heart hypothesis stuff was really coming out, there's actually a number of different RCTs on like prisoners or like other sort of institutionalized populations where they could actually control the diet. And they were like, okay, this group is taking sunflower oil capsules, to the tune of 20 grams a day or whatever, and we're going to see what happens. And so, that those stuff, they weren't as well controlled from what we understand now with regards to the biochemical mechanisms, but at least they were trying to do this. But then sort of once the 60s was over, then the NIH isn't interested in funding that type of stuff
Right.
anymore. So the most recent RCT was done by Kevin Hall and co-authors in 2019, and they basically randomized ultra processed food versus natural food, and they matched up all the macros and like the calories per weight unit, and then they basically said just eat as much as you want and if you're in the treatment group, you're getting a lot of junk food. If you're in the control group, you're getting a lot of not processed foods.
Mhm.
And then we're gonna see how much you eat, how much energy you're expending, all this stuff. But they're only able to do that for 30 days because it costs a lot of money, and they had to be like in a hospital at the NIH headquarters. And so like that's kind of the most recent version of one of these, but it's they easily spent $2 million on that.
And does that have any useful findings or?
I mean, you can look it up. I would say that the findings are definitely consistent with the seed oil hypothesis, though the authors wouldn't want to have it be interpreted that way.
Yeah,
Um,
they would want it to be interpreted in light of processed and not processed.
yeah, exactly. But that doesn't really do anything for policy to know
Yes.
what about the processing is harmful.
Yes.
I mean, to me, I think you just think back to what was food like in 1850, or what were people eating in 1850. That then we know that there was basically no obesity back then,
Yes.
or
That's
heart
where I was
disease,
going next.
or any of this stuff. So, at the basic level, you can make the seed oils argument by just saying, well, there's this new substance that's in the food supply that wasn't in there in the
Yes.
past. So that has to at least be doing something. Now,
And so,
maybe we are eating a lot more sugar now than we were then,
yeah.
but I still don't necessarily, there's, depending on if you're talking about carbs or sugar. I mean, the other kind of quandary is that there's lots of indigenous peoples throughout the world that have vastly different diets, but all have very good health
Yes.
relative to the standard Western diet.
Right.
And so that also sort of brings up questions about what should be the dietary advice. Because there's like some people that only eat sweet potatoes, and then there's other people that only eat
Yes.
seal meat,
Yeah.
or whatever.
So let's talk about the cross country stuff. Um, what's the relationship between seed oil consumption and obesity in different areas of the world? Is that something we can even look at?
I mean, there's data from the WHO on obesity rates, and then there's data from the United Nations on seed oil supply in the food supply of each country. And so, in my paper, I have a graph with that correlation. It's quite low. It's about 0.2, which is a much lower correlation than sort of the time series correlations earlier in the paper. And, just sort of anecdotally, you know, East Asia cuisine has a lot of frying and seed oil type of stuff. But then, Japan and Korea have pretty low obesity rates compared to the UK or the US or Canada. And
So, but
so,
Europe and the US, Canada, all similar trends,
I mean, France and Italy and Spain are going to have lower levels than the UK.
lower
Uh,
obesity levels.
yeah,
Okay.
obesity and lower seed oil as well.
Yeah.
Um, so, this kind of just goes back to the question of the US state differences. And then is there some cultural aspect
Yeah.
that's just this dark matter that, it's going to be really hard to measure.
It'll be hard to tease that out.
In Japan, maybe they eat a lot of these oils, but then they also eat like a lot of fresh vegetables, and they're eating tons of vegetables at every meal. So maybe they're getting a better omega balance, even
Right.
if they're still eating omega-6.
Yes.
So yeah, these are questions that are valid for the question at hand, but that are going to be hard to resolve without some well-designed experiment.
So, given where you're at with your work on this, uh, are there even policy implications at this point, or
I mean,
early?
definitely we should be taking this hypothesis more seriously, I would say. The last thing I would want is to turn this into the diet heart hypothesis 2.0,
Right.
where we make a bunch of wholesale changes on stuff that is not as well understood. So the diet heart hypothesis, it wasn't bad that there was some potentially incorrect science being published and promoted. It was
Right.
bad that everyone bought into it hook, line, and sinker, and then it became a dogma that couldn't be challenged.
Yes.
And so I definitely think that, providing more information to consumers is a relatively benign policy.
Right.
So expanding the food label to list polyunsaturated by omega-6 and omega-3.
Mhm.
I don't see that as being a huge deal. But of
Right.
course, the FDA is not going to go for that.
Why not?
And the food companies are going to be livid because every part of that food label is the result of bargaining between the food companies and the FDA.
Okay.
And you have to make a case for the that this information is actually salient, that the
Yes.
consumers are going to pay attention to it. You can't overload the consumers.
Right.
So it's going to be tough. And some of this stuff has been studied in other countries. So I don't know if you're aware, but in Chile, they have a lot more detailed food labels, and they have even like some uh like front end packaging that looks kind of like a cigarette packaging about like health impacts if you consume this food.
Yes. Known to the state of California to cause cancer kind of stuff.
Yeah, that type of thing. And so a team of economists, so the last names are Barjona, Otero, and Otero. They have like a very recent econometrica paper showing how the food companies adjust to the new food regulations.
Huh?
So basically, once you get this ominous looking label on your packaging,
Yeah.
people are not going to want to buy the food.
Yeah.
And so you're going to want to reformulate to get just below whatever the cutoff is to determine eligibility of having the ominous logo.
Right.
And then from there, you're going to avoid that packaging, but then consumers are going to substitute. So if I wanted to buy like a pack of ramen noodles and one of them had a black, scary looking label and the other one didn't,
Yeah.
I'd buy the one that didn't, but it's really not that different of a health impact in the end.
Right.
And so you have to also think about the political economy ramifications of any potential policy change
Right.
and the idea that the food manufacturers are going to try to get around it as much as they can.
Yes. Now you're producing very specific incentives for the producers,
Exactly.
but you're really not advocating for, scorched earth, just ban all seed oils from all production processes. So you're
I
sort
mean,
of
I don't
forced into
think,
making some kind of trade-off.
yeah, I mean, I don't think that's a good idea just strictly because of the adjustment costs to such a regime change.
Right. Can
Like
you
there's,
discuss that a little bit for people who might not be familiar with an adjustment
sure.
cost?
So, I have a bunch of farmers who are growing soybeans right now with the expectation that they'll sell them on the market for a particular profit. Those soybeans are going to be used by different manufacturers for different purposes. They're going to end up in our food. So if we just said today, all right, no more soybeans allowed to be grown in the US, then those farmers suddenly have to figure out in 2 months what are they going to start planting,
Right.
and they're going to have to, yeah, basically it's going to be very disruptive because they've got equipment that's designed to be used with soybeans.
Right.
They've got the know-how, and they're going to have to change to a different crop. And so, yeah, I think at the end of the day, you would want that sort of thing to be gradual. And the way that you would make that gradual is just by informing consumers that these things are not great. And then demand would eventually shift inward. And then on the margin, you might have some farmer who's sort of got one foot in soybeans, got one foot in some other commodity. And they're like, okay, well, if the soybeans aren't there this year, I'll switch over.
Right.
And then that's sort of the gradual process by which you'd rearrange affairs.
Yeah. That's interesting. But you've been really generous with your time. We're almost to an hour and a half now, so I do kind of want to bring this in for a landing. And given how comprehensive this discussion has been, the question that I really would like to ask is, I'm I saw this paper and it really became kind of as a thing that I'm thinking about, thing that's happening a little bit in my personal life. And I see your paper and I think, wow, this is much more mainstream conversation than I really thought it was. I sort of thought, I'm at risk of being a conspiracy theorist kind of person. And so I'd kind of like you to discuss a little bit to bring us in for a landing, where you see this potentially going, just as a discussion, as economists weighing in, as government policy potentially being up for discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think economists have so much to contribute to obesity because they understand the trade-offs, they understand the incentives, they understand thinking at the margin. So they understand that if the government is proposing a certain policy, then people are going to respond in a particular way. And the notion of, I think it's Goodhart's law, which is like once a target becomes known, then the behavior adjusts to meet the target. Um, and so basically, you know, not having all this knowledge and being able to model these sorts of incentives and trade-offs, that's going to result in better informed policies. So, like an example is there's been a lot of analysis of the tax on sugar sweetened beverages. So you might say, well, hey, seed oils are bad for health. Let's tax them in the same way we would tax tobacco because tobacco is bad for health. So we call that a Pigouvian tax. And so economists could then, put their know-how to work and figure out, okay, what's the exact welfare implications of this tax that's being proposed? Who's going to be made better off? Who's going to be made worse off? And at the end of the day, it's going to come down to politics, unfortunately. But that's how our world works. And so, in the meantime, if you're wondering about this stuff, I just encourage you to read up more about it. I think the reason this is becoming more mainstream is because the evidence is piling up. Like once you see the graph of like obesity versus seed oils versus sugar, like it's hard not to find that compelling, even if it might be driven by something else. And so, I would just encourage people to become informed. You be the judge. There's plenty of good books out there that can explain these things. I think I've probably read a dozen books on this topic, broadly speaking. So if you have if you want recommendations for reading, I'm happy to, you can just email me and I'm happy to correspond. But I think information at the personal level is really key. And then once enough people, feel that way, then that's when change can actually be made because that's when people will vote in mass at the polls for particular policies or particular candidates. But it has to come from the grassroots.
My guest today has been Tyler Ransom. Tyler, thanks for joining us on the Econ Buff.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Lee. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Econ Buff, where we find applications of economic thought in a variety of topics and fields. If you enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to check out our previous episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Amazon Podcasts under the title Econ Buff Podcast, and be sure to like and subscribe. For updates and information, visit our website at econbuffpodcast.wixsite.com. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. Drop us an email at econbuffpodcast@yahoo.com.